Speaking of Thanks, John. Friends, thanks for gathering. This is an important topic in my world as a youth worker and also as a dad that has young children. We're not close to teenage years. Bennett turned 4 and Bailey turned just 2 on Friday. And so I still have some time, but I've been working with teenagers for a good long while. Good morning. Thanks for being here. Why you might be here is a plethora of reasons. Maybe you just like Sunday school and you come here out of habit, and that's great. Maybe you have a teenager in your midst. Maybe you have a grandchild who's in their teenage years or about to be in those years. Maybe you just care for young people and you're out of here for compassionate reasons. Maybe it's the opposite, and young people are difficult for you, and this is going to be a class that will maybe help you navigate those folks that you might be working alongside or engaging with in the community. I'm here because when I was 16, I started youth leading with my church as a high school leader to our middle schoolers. And so that was about 19 years ago that I started doing that. And ever since that time, I've always been in youth ministry in some capacity. I don't know, I couldn't count up the hours I've spent with teenagers, but a lot. I've spent a lot of time with teenagers over these last 20 years, and I'm grateful for it, and I felt called to it. And as an 18-year-old, I was on a service trip to Ensenada, Mexico, where the camp speaker said, "Is anyone called to ministry? Please stand up, we'll pray for you." And as an 18-year-old, I stood up because I felt so called into youth ministry. So that's why I'm here. And I continue that work with our middle and high school students at this church, and I've been doing that for nearly 13 years now. So that's why I'm here. It's maybe why you're here. And I want to read this passage to you as an encouraging place to start. This is in Luke's Gospel in the 2nd chapter. You have the scripture in front of you. I'm going to skip down about halfway. There's a census happening in Jerusalem. Jesus and his parents are traveling there. It's a big family affair. They're caravanning to Jerusalem and then back to where they're living, and they realize in transit that they don't have Jesus with them. And I'm picking up about a third of the way down. When they did not find Jesus, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously looking for you." And Jesus said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Friends, if Jesus was going to be a sassy teenager to his parents, what hope do we have for the rest of us? This is the Son of God behaving in this way, where there's a disconnect between parent and child, parent and youth. That sets the tone for this particular journey that we're on with teenagers. There's something physiological, there's something about that being a teenager that sometimes brings out a counterintuitive, sometimes unproductive disconnect. And that's part of the reason that we're gathering. But Jesus turned out great, as do most of our teenagers. And what will help them is our patience, our fortitude, the things that we can model, and us educating ourselves on their world, which looks largely different than the world that we're accustomed to. So here's a quick icebreaker, and I want us to be quick about it. I want you to think about, access your memory when you were a teenager, and then I've given you 3 prompts. Please just turn to your neighbor, someone who's close to you, and answer one of these things. Share your celebrity icon. What was cool to wear? What was in style? Or did you get in trouble? And if not, was it only because you weren't caught? Okay, those. I'll give you 45 seconds to have this conversation.
Oh yeah.
Well, I also thought it was study, but I went to an interview. I was tired of training this teenage daughter. I know. I still love it. Because actually I was going to be there. I think what we can do is try to get some rabbit. And I am the straightest. And so I would go and I'd get up and try to rap and pray and
Oh, okay. All right, friends, I'm going to gather you back. When I was a teenager, baggy jeans, a baggy sweatshirt in the Pacific Northwest where the climate is cool. It was the baggy kind of cozy combination that I was. I had a buzz cut, real short, all high school long. And the social media I had was MySpace. And MySpace was brand new. And so that was sort of the popular thing of my teenage years. You all know C.S. Lewis in his book, Joy, the Shape of My Early Life. He describes something that he coins as chronological snobbery. You have the actual quote there, but it's essentially this idea that we who are integrated into our own trends and our own norms look outward to other generations with their norms and their trends, and we have a little snobbery, where we think we're right and they're wrong. And this is how we sometimes get to the vernacular of, this is what's wrong with our world. Gen Z, millennials, boomers. It goes both ways, and there's this chronological snobbery that happens that we are very much aware of in our lives. And I'm saying, let's not do that. It's not the sum total of any generation that accounts for the world's problems. We have the particular realities of teenagers in front of us, and that's the reality that we're going to contend with. Let's withhold our judgments, though there's some fair judgments we can make. But let's try to be more constructive as we move towards helping and walking alongside our teenagers. A quick note about de-guilting parents or grandparents, or as you are in conversations with those who are parenting teenagers, boy, is it hard. Well, my mom, who's visiting from Washington State, has told me in the last year that she did not like me when I was in 7th grade. Just being honest, but it was a matter of, it's just a hard time, a hard moment. We have these natural disconnects, and that's going to be an experience of a lot of our parents. Maybe universally, there's going to be those harder years for us to engage with, for folks from your community or your own tribe, and however you are encountering teenagers. And it's good for us to realize that we are trying our best, that we have limited data, that we are moving towards things that we often have no experience with. And for our parents and grandparents, those who try to nurture a relationship with teenagers, give yourself a break. We're trying to do a really hard thing and meeting them where they're at. And the world that they are living in is a brand new world. We are all pioneers in that. And so just take heart, even if we go through, if you can say, oh my gosh, I did this. I'm guilty of this. That's going to happen. And that's okay because we didn't know, and now we know, and that's the nature of all parenting after every generation that's dated. Did you know seatbelts are good? You know seatbelts are good for cars and safety. Well, at the time, we didn't know that, and you probably look backwards and say, I remember being in Old Betsy, my grandmother's station wagon, in the back seat that faced the back with no seatbelts. And so there's room for us to give ourselves some grace. I'm going to be utilizing really 3 sources for this class. This is called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. This is my primary resource. If you have not read this and you are interested in this topic, buy this book, read this book. John can maybe grab you a link for this. This is another really popular one. This preceded this book. This is called iGen by Dr. Jean Twenge, and she's the correlation between these researches were profound. And so this is to say that we're really on target as it comes to the data that's coming about with our young people and social media and societal trends. And this is more of a parenting resource. This is by Brene Brown. It's called Daring Greatly, How the Courage to be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead. And we'll really utilize this next week as we talk about modeling transparency, vulnerability, how we walk alongside our young people in relationship. But this is the main primary source, Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation. I'm talking about an entire group of people that span about 15 years, Gen Z. And by doing so, we're going to have to use a lot of generalization. It's going to be large brush strokes as we paint an entire generation. And a lot of the data that I'm going to speak to, really, while all of them are contending with these challenges, only about 25 to 30%, which is an enormous percentage, are contending with the biggest hardships of the data that we'll move through. It's to say that this is a significant problem. We're going to feel a little despairing at times as we read through the data. This is the most despairing class. We will grow more positive as we move towards the next 2 weeks. But there is just the real contending with the problem. And if we're oblivious to it, we can't help. And so part of us getting in the right place is knowing and orienting ourselves to the challenges that they're facing, though I'm going to speak about these things really in general terms. So Gen Z is the generation born between 1997 and 2012. They're our kind of oldest youth right now. Our youngest youth, by youth I mean teenager, 13, 14-year-olds, that's Gen Alpha. The very similar in terms of trends and the data that supports this idea is Gen Z primarily does not know a world without technology. That is how we understand technology now. Gen Alpha has always known the full extent of what we have in terms of technology and social media. And so even as our Gen Zers have been grown up in the midst of so much, it's sort of, there's a pinnacle of technology and social media that we're experiencing right now that some of our Gen Z students have avoided. But that's why they have these generational lines between Gen Z and Gen Alpha. Who is Gen Z? Think about someone in their teens, early 20s. That's a Gen Z person right now. There are a lot of good qualities to Gen Z folks. This is a compassionate group of people. They care about inclusion. They care about acceptance. They know how to utilize technology in the ways that benefit communities and societies. They have a real ethos of not just accepting how things are, but how things should be. And they move and work towards the ideal. Gen Z, in a lot of ways, will move us towards a more moral and righteous place. That's true from faith and every other facet of life. They're also exceedingly anxious. The anxious generation, because so much of the impact psychologically and neurologically of social media and technology, the side effect of those things is a general anxiety. And we've seen a difficulty in how to integrate into what we'd say the real world, or maybe a less than virtual world. And so Gen Z is a really lovely generation, but they have some unique challenges. Millennials were moving through this technological boom right after the birth of social media, like kind of the main social media that we know now. And so so I'm a millennial, and I did not have to contend with the anxiety and the challenges that Gen Z does because I was post-puberty when I was in the thick of social media. And we'll talk about the neuroscience that makes that a really important detail. But just know that Gen Z and Gen Alpha, while they're up against enormous challenges, they have so much to offer, and we should be hopeful about the generations that will serve the church and the world around us in years to come. Here are some of the big challenges that we move towards. Jonathan Haidt says that we struggle with a culture of safetyism, where we like to protect our children and youth in the real physical world, but we often underprotect them in the virtual world. It's to say that no longer are you allowed to walk through your own neighborhood to go to the park by yourself at any sort of young age, 8, 9 years old, maybe when you're 13, 14. The data on that is a big skew. You might remember when you were allowed some autonomy, when it felt okay for you to be safe to walk by yourself to a certain place. The age is getting older and older for that sort of autonomy. We're kind of clamping down and becoming more cautious, especially as Gen Z and millennials become parents. We're a cautious group. But we are underprotected in the virtual world because we don't know to be. And our young people are really savvy, really tech savvy. And so even when we put up parameters, even when we try to create good boundaries around social media and technology, our young people often know how to step right on over it, circumvent it. And while we all have really sweet children and grandchildren, teenagers at their hearts are rebellious. That's going to be a compelling factor in the choices that they make. And so this is a challenge. Jonathan Haidt says that phone-based childhoods are far less forgiving than play-based childhoods. And so when our when our middle adolescents were playing at the playground, they might get more bumps and bruises and scars. They might actually visit the hospital more often, but their psychology was well intact. Now, hospitalizations are plummeting for physical ailments. There's far less broken bones than there once were. The hospitalizations for mental health reasons are skyrocketing, and so that's the change in trend here. And so that's a reality of moving from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. Girls are growing up more anxious, more prone to comparison, and with unhealthy, unrealistic self-images. And unfortunately, the data is very clear that our young girls, our teenage girls, are impacted by social media to a far worse extent than our boys. It's bad on both ends. It's not to say that our boys just overcome this. And again, I'm speaking in great generalization here, but in general, the trend is that our boys are suffering in different ways. Our girls are struggling particularly as it relates to social media. We'll talk about that. Our boys are growing up more apathetic, purposeless, and isolated. The pit of technological distractions that they face, phone and video games, gaming of a variety of ways, have, it's called an opportunity cost. Essentially, it's time wasting, where you could have moved towards something that would, a job, something, or a friendship, something that is really productive in life, that is being supplanted with a game, and that is as not as productive, not nearly as productive. Okay, now we actually have to go through the raw, unfortunate data. On my notes, I think in your notes it just says the data. On my notes it says the unfortunately rather dark data. That's how I described it here. And I'm going to read a section here from Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, on puberty. Brain researchers say neurons that fire together wire together, meaning that activities that repeatedly activate a constellation of neurons cause those neurons to connect more closely. If a child goes through puberty doing a lot of archery, or painting, or video games, or social media, those activities will cause lasting structural changes in the brain, especially if they are rewarding. Heightened susceptibility to stress in adolescence is a specific example of the fact that puberty makes the brain more malleable or plastic. This makes adolescence both a time of risk, because if the brain's plasticity increases, the chances that exposure to a stressful experience will cause harm. To say that we have vulnerable kids from a physiological perspective. Our teenagers are, the plasticity of the brain makes it so that the imprinting on the things that they're doing make an especially big imprinting. I would go on to say that social media is rarely healthy for anyone. If it's used in its most pure form, it would be a matter of connecting with each other authentically, to reach out to that college roommate that you hadn't talked to in a couple decades. So that might be the place where it's really a good use of social media. But as you probably know, if you were on Facebook or have ever been on Facebook, that's not the scope of social media. And so we're all vulnerable and susceptible to some of the negative elements of technology, but our young, those who are going through puberty, are particularly vulnerable. And it's why we see this huge incline in mental health crises with our youth, because the stressors that they experience through technology, through social media, have this great negative impact. I could show you, I had about 40 sticky notes in this book before this class that just outline different graphs, different data points that look at the trends in the last, basically when the iPhone came to be, that was like the main study section. I think it was like 2007 to 2014. And you just see at that pivotal place where technology, smartphones came into existence, the accessibility of social media and the internet, that's when you start to see the plummeting of good mental health and the rise of feeling anxious, feeling depressed, feeling isolated, feeling purposeless. And we're contending with that. Here's another, I think, important thing to outline in terms of why it affects our young girls and really the dangers of our social media. Researchers in France exposed young women either to media photographs of very thin women or to media photographs of average-sized women. They found that the young women exposed to images of very thin women became more anxious about their own body and appearance. But here's the surprising thing. The images were flashed on a screen for just 20 milliseconds, too fast for the women to become consciously aware of what they had seen. The authors conclude that social comparison takes place outside awareness and affects explicit self-evaluation. This means that the frequent reminders girls give each other that social media is not reality are likely to only have a limited effect, because the part of the brain that is doing the comparisons is not governed by the part of the brain that knows consciously that they are seeing only edited, highlighted reels. Why that? So, yes, sir.
Where did you say that was done?
In France.
It would never make it through a review board in this country.
Might be so. And a sad truth of we are not always geared towards trying to find the most healthy alternatives, or just even discover how bad the problems can be.
What year was the book written?
I think 2022. This is
It's
recent.
fairly recent.
Yeah.
I mean, it might even be last year.
This-
23.
Yeah, this is, copyright 2024.
Yeah. He was
Early
just
part
on
of this year.
morning shows and stuff like that earlier this spring,
Yeah.
talking about the book. So.
And
It's new.
it's not, and this is why I looked up another, there's a lot of trends that are being seen in a variety of researchers, social scientists, and I could tell you anecdotally about my time with teenagers, even at this church, and the pressures. I taught on your phone in your brain. That was a lesson I gave our high schoolers 2 weeks ago, 2 Wednesdays ago, and 2 of those high school girls came up to me afterwards and said, "I'm deleting my Instagram. I'm deleting my Instagram because lately I've been, homecoming pictures just came out, and it's just making me feel terrible about myself if I'm deleting Instagram." And I followed up with her this past Wednesday. I said, "Are you back on?" And she said, "No, I have deleted. I feel a lot better." And there's a lot of anecdotal, even research that Jonathan Haidt points to about those young people who are Baker active, on the verge of suicide, really depressive episodes, who are removed from their homes, removed from their cell phones, and weeks into the rehab process, they're coming out of that well. And when the phone comes back into their lives, they see a dip. And there's just sort of an obvious direct correlation between how much time we're spending on our phone, the types of apps we have on our phone, and the mental health of our young people. The report I reference here of France, why that's so problematic is we might have the great intention and even to reinforce this with our youth. We might say, you can't compare yourself to those on Instagram. It's fake. They're editing their pictures. Don't do this. And you might say, well, I have a mature daughter or a mature granddaughter. Of course, she's just going to step over this. This is to say it's not about maturity. It's not to say that you have a level-headed or not level-headed grandchild. It's to say that the way that it imprints on the brain is damaging, and it's not even conscious. It's not becoming sort of this abstract idea that they're conversing with. It's hardwired data directly into the brain that leaves our young women feeling rather discouraged, more prone to comparison, more prone to some self-loathing, which is really brutal. For our boys, the graphs change. It's not so much about anxiety and mental health. It's more about feeling meaningless, purposeless. You've probably heard the term failure to launch. This is what's being more of the challenge in front of our boys. They are reporting, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. I don't feel, they're lacking kind of the cultural milestones that we have had. And in place, they have just spent so much time towards a non-productive outcome. And so they get kind of stuck in this apathy. Again, I've got anecdotal data that I could share with you, but it's just very clear that some of our boys get so discouraged and guideless, and that's a huge problem. And technology and social media really is the intersection in which this is happening. You all familiar with an algorithm? An algorithm is what a social media app or site will use to develop content specific to you. Have you ever had this moment where you were like talking with a friend or you're Googling, we need a new vacuum cleaner. Our vacuum cleaner is terrible. And so you're Googling vacuum cleaners. Black Friday's coming up, and so you're doing your research. And then for the next 3 weeks, your Facebook or even your internet is just like selling you vacuum cleaners. It's like, try this one's on sale. That is the algorithm at work. In every social media site, every app has an algorithm. This is what we call targeted ads. And that works in terms of selling us things. It also works in cultivating very specific content for our youth, for our teenagers. And so if I'm a teenage girl and I click on a Instagram reel, which is like a video, and it speaks to a juicing cleanse, the diet that I should have, and it's a very thin Instagram model-esque person, that becomes a part of my algorithm because I've engaged with the content. And so now it's not just this one woman who's appeared on my Instagram feed, but now it's a dozen who look a lot like her, who say a lot of the same things, and a message gets reinforced subconsciously and explicitly. And that's dangerous material. And this doesn't just affect our youth. I was sitting with coffee with a 25-year-old who has a 17-year-old sister, and the 25-year-old was telling me about this rough moment between her 17-year-old sister and her mother. And they were in the car, and the mother is active on TikTok. You know, TikTok is the social media app. And her mother, because of her encounters on TikTok, has a confidence that the end of the world is coming, that the kind of Christian end times are coming. And that has been now, she's in that content, she's getting that algorithm is feeding that. So she's having a lot of voices reinforce it's becoming a part of her worldview, the mother. And the mother is saying to the 17-year-old daughter who's crying in the back seat because she just wants to go to college and get to live a normal life, she's devastated that she's not going to get to because the world's ending. And the mother's sitting in the driver's seat saying, yeah, I'm sorry, honey. And the 25-year-old sister is telling me this story, and it's a scary little story because it's not just our youth who are impacted by an algorithm, but we see that social media and technology often shapes our worldview. This is true of politics. This is true of things that have a apolitical element to it. We have to be very careful for that, and this is where we can find some common ground with our youth, with our teenagers. But our brains are already hardwired in a way that theirs are not. So we're a little more protected, especially as it relates to self-conception, how we see and understand ourselves. Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of the mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. As we are the church out in the world, as we are the church to our young people, that's a good verse for us to live by, because the world is very accepting of unhealthy behavior. The world is very accepting of things that even have a tendency to hurt or misguide our children. We step in counterculturally. We need to kind of create protective barriers. We'll talk a little bit about how we do that in a practical, functional way, even in the midst of our own relationships as we move towards week 2 and week 3 of this class. But it's a good thing for us to have in the back of our mind that maybe even our own technology practices might need some reform. Maybe we need to model some changes of how we engage with our technologies. There was a documentary on Netflix, maybe 6-7 years ago. It was called The Social Dilemma. You ever heard of this? The Social Dilemma? It was an interview of sort of the CEO and top designers, builders of all of our social media apps, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. And there was one question that the interviewer gave. He said, well, do you let your children participate on Twitter or Instagram? And all of them, without fail, said no. No, we don't let our children on this. Our children don't have phones. And these are the people who have designed, built. They know the ins and outs of the apps that they have built into the world, and they do not let their children on them. And so, yeah, it's kind of crazy to think that you might tell a 15-year-old or a family of a 15-year-old, say, no, I don't think your child should have a smartphone yet as a high schooler. That's very countercultural. That's going to be rejected strongly. Imagine going up to a 16-year-old girl right now who's been on Instagram for 5 years and say, you're going to be off it from now. Think of the backlash in your household, and a lot of parents don't want to take on that backlash. It's hard enough just to do breakfast happily, and so let alone integrating these more challenging things like maybe a healthier distance away from our social media. I know this has been a bummer of a class. It's not lost on me, but I felt it's very important to start at this place to recognize we have a real problem here. This will not fix it on itself. Even as parents, I've had some conversations with some dads around this book, and they hear me and they trust me as an authority, and I know their children, and they're pretty resistant to any sort of change, just because they don't feel like they can navigate. Ironically, they're not in this class right now, and I'm wishing they were, because there are things that we can do as a community that we can support parents and families with, and that's going to be the work of the next 2 weeks. We're the church. Yeah, Kim.
Can I ask you something?
Sure.
I noticed, because I sub in the schools, that the schools are really starting to, all of them are starting this no phones, no phones, no phones. It's part of the Hillsborough County thing now.
Miami-Dade just did this,
Yeah.
or Broward County, excuse me. Broward County just did that for this school year.
Yeah.
And I think the data is going to be really reinforcing to those decisions of those school boards.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting. What I notice is that it's not such a problem in middle school. It's a huge problem in high school. And I think it's because those kids are more addicted than the middle schoolers who haven't had phones as long and haven't,
Yep.
But it seems to work, at least at Coleman, that you can't have your phone at school. And that, they have them, but they put them up, or they don't, but they can't bring them out. And it seems to be working in class. but it sure isn't working in high school.
So St. John's Episcopal just had a parent group book study on this book, The Anxious Generation. It's an example of another school in this community that takes it seriously, and they want to get to these ends because the data is really, it's hard to argue for it. No, I want my child on TikTok for 6 hours a day. And it's really hard to argue that. And quantity is a really important, it's an indicator of how bad things might get. And so if you went from 6 hours a day on your phone to 2 hours a day on your phone, it would have a dramatic change to the likelihood that you're going to have negative repercussions here. And so cutting out all school time as time in the day that you actively cannot access your phone is a step in the right direction. And I think school boards are seeing that. Teachers are tired of having to say, hey, I can see you texting under the desk. And so there's going to be, I think, some good synergy and some positive outcomes as it relates to the school. And once I think schools start doing this, well, then maybe communities and family friends can start joining this together. Can McKay and I with our boys 10 years from now, this is my wife McKay, by the way, she's super good. Can we with we have a 4-year-old son, Bennett, 10 years from now when it's going to become a real challenge because there's going to be a lot of 14-year-olds who have social media, who have smartphones, can we with the parents of his friend group gather together and say, can we commit to not giving them a smartphone until they're 16? Can we do that work? And that's going to be a part of, I think, the next 10 years of data. What's nice is parents love their children. It's great that that is true, because when we actually see up close just how much we are putting our children in harm's way when we have too loose of boundaries with social media and technology, I think we're a little more compelled to make those necessary changes, even when it's going to create some conflict. And so I think we're on the early start of this conversation. As Kim mentions, we're going to have, I think, the impacts of the school help us. What a great thing that that's the case. Let's end with a little bit of hope, and then I want to leave some time for your questions. And my hope is that, John, you can help write down for me some of the questions that are raised up, because I have the things that are interesting to me, things that are relevant to me, but I'm really curious what would be most helpful for you to hear. As you navigate personal experiences with children and grandchildren, what you do vocationally, what you want to do with your volunteerism, I would like for us to be able to sculpt the class to your desire and your interest. As it relates to teenagers. Okay, we'll stay on that. Here's some hope. It's good to end with hope. There's still time to make changes. Even for a 17-year-old whose brain is a little hardwired by the social media, that 17-year-old can leave all of this behind with some boundaries, with some intentional conversations, with maturity, with any harm done can likely be undone as it relates to these sort of things. I take a bit more time with our truly addicted teenagers, but there's a lot that we can still do. The data is emerging, and parents, churches, and schools are thoughtful in light of it. The church is always going to be a source of meaning. When we think about young men who are feeling purposeless, the church is a great antidote. I would be very comfortable in seeing our young men stand up and do good things in the church, as I would feel about our young women too. But in terms of trying to fight their lack of identity and their feeling purposeless, the church can step into really practical ways here. I mentioned how multiple students deleted their Instagrams after just one conversation. That was truly a 12-minute conversation that I had with our high schoolers. When we start to inform parents and the education of all of this challenge happens, once it's reinforced by many caring adults or young people, even in their rebellious nature, we'll look at it. They're right. They'll see, okay, this is really starting to line up, and we'll do this work. Matthew 19:14, but Jesus said, let the children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven. Our teenagers aren't our littlest children anymore, but they're still our children. Jesus models this, and we take on that charge. We are going to still hold the hand and carry even our youth, our 17-year-olds, through their experience of this church, even as they're coming in to visit us from college. I think now we say that adolescence lasts till 26, 28. I think we keep pushing back that line. We say that there's still time to walk our children forward to Christ, towards the church, to hope. I'm grateful that anyone showed up today. Me and John could have had a real good conversation about this, but it is nice to have you folks in this room. And so I leave the rest of our time. What questions do you have? What might we dedicate the time to in the future as it relates to youth, technology, social media, the church?
I was really interested in coming to class, in John's class, because what I do for a living and have for the last 21 plus years now is I prep students privately for their SAT exams. So everyone who comes in to see me is between the age of 15, mostly 16 to 18. And I work with them, and I've done it for so long. I've watched the generations coming through. I've seen the styles, the attitudes, everything. And I really have a wonderful relationship with my kids. I love them because I'm with them one-on-one for 2 hours each. And I really get to talk to them, and they appreciate that because they feel they're not really listened to or spoken to, but they're stuck with me for 2 hours, you know? So I would really appreciate if any of y'all during the course of this, I'm serious, during the course of these next couple of weeks, think of questions to ask them that might be pertinent to bringing out how they're feeling. I don't know that I'm saying that well. I don't know.
I think you are saying it well. And I think
I would love, because I'm teaching the whole time, believe me. We're very engaged in passing that darn SAT for their SATs. But I do interact with them. And I'm working into their lessons. For example, I learned several years ago that, well, many years ago, students didn't know what a prepositional phrase was. And one of the first ways I learned it was I thought I was being funny. And I said, do you know the song, Over the River and Through the Woods? And I thought, but I identified that's a prepositional phrase. They didn't know the song at all. None of them, and they come from educated homes. And it's just amazing. So anything that sparks a conversation is good, you know?
Thank you for sharing. It's hugely helpful. We often see teenagers kind of on an island. It's a scary tribe. And we say, oh, the way that they interact with the world around them, who they are, how truly what we see them doing and saying, we feel the disconnect. And so we kind of feel maybe the temptation to kind of step away. And we say, we'll let that tribe grow into people before welcoming them back onto the mainland. And what you're describing is, no, we can have just an earnest conversation with teenagers, and you're reporting they're responsive to it. Even just in the direct, if you show your care for a young person, and it's authentic, they're highly intuitive creatures, our teenagers, and so they'll pick up on that.
Yeah.
I cannot tell you how many times I've sat down and had a coffee with a teenager, and didn't teach them the Bible, didn't pray with them, didn't talk about matters of faith. I just engaged with them, just asking questions about their life. And you'll hear about it on a senior speech on Youth Sunday about how meaningful, because they're interpreting that, they translate that as God's love. Just in your showing up and being present, just in that authentic engagement.
Tell them about the student at the graduation.
Yeah, one of my students gave his speech actually at Wharton High School, which was named after my dad. And he gave his speech on who was Paul Wharton. And he said that he said his generation doesn't know who people are anymore. They don't connect to it. And he felt it was an amazing speech. He was the president of his class. And he said, you know, it's important to know who surrounds you, where you come from, and we don't even know who school we've attended to for 3 years before whatever. Who Paul Wharton was.
The lack of connection.
Lack of connection, yeah, yeah, and he gave an amazing speech on that.
It's a good example. History and our connections with other generations and our own personal relationship. That's maybe on the decline and at a loss in general, because building connections and having that sense of history is really important. We hope to do that in this church, even as we move towards centennial, even as we continue to celebrate youth and confirmation and Youth Sunday, giving them places to touch and intersect with history, and for them to kind of grow an appreciation for who they do have around them, and who has been here. Even just the youth program, the generosity that folks have done, things in terms of their giving and the ways that they've pledged and committed to the youth programs, supplying scholarships for camp. It's good for students to make those connections, that there are caring adults in the community that seek to benefit them, to bless them. And so that's, I need to consider that as I think about trying to build those connections for them and facilitate that as a work.
I think one of the interesting things that happens is that whether historically, whether it's 1800s, 1700s, 1900s, that the children gravitate toward the grandparents. And they skip over the parents, and then they want to go to the grandparents for reinforcement and for, insight and things like that. And my parents are awful. Well, let's not talk about that. Let's talk about, what's on your mind. And I think grandparents now play an increasingly more important role in the guidance of children.
I agree, and I think in youth literature, this has been true for the last 2 decades. A youth to be successful requires about 5 or 6 caring adults. Whatever metric we use for achievement or success grows considerably once a child as a youth has 5 or 6 caring adults in their lives. And that can be outside of their parents. So it could be coach, it could be pastor, it could be teacher, it could be grandparent, aunt, uncle, neighbor. But if a child has 5 or 6 caring adults surrounding them, that's part of their web of support, they statistically have a much likelier chance to be successful. I'm seeing a question from you, Janice. How can a grandparent positively relay their feelings concerning too much technology in the home to the children's parents? Yeah, you are moving us towards, hopefully, the practical side of what can we do about this. I've raised up this big obstacle, this big hurdle. Now, how can we get over it? Please come back next week and the following week, because we'll have more time to talk that out. But I would say, in light of what we've already been speaking about, your authentic care will be picked up on. Tone is really important. If you say to your grandchild, can you put that phone down? We're having time at the dinner right now, or at the dinner table. That will not be received because of the tone of it. But in a conversation, when you pull your grandchild aside and you say, I know our worlds look a lot different, but sweetie, I'm really quite concerned. I just see you, so that give them a chance to speak to it. Make it a dialogue and not necessarily a lecture, and I think that will go a long way. That's not a good enough answer. Janice, please come back. You all, please come back. I think I have to run.
Yeah. So I want to appreciate Kenny's time. He is preaching across the morning, so he has had a full morning, continues to have a full morning. So I'm going to close this out with a word of prayer. If you all have any additional questions, please come see me afterwards. I'll jot those down for Kenny. Kenny, we're going to let you get out of here.
Thank you very much. Thanks, friends. I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Kenny. And we will see him next week. So let's go ahead and close the time with prayer. Gracious and loving God, we are grateful for the gift of this day and grateful for this time together. God, we know that you are a God of all generations. Just as we remember our own teen years and those of our children or grandchildren now, we celebrate that you are present with us and walk with us through those challenges and also those wonderful moments as well. God will continue to guide us as we think about how we can be a church family that truly supports and nurtures all members of that family, and guide us throughout that and our week ahead. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen. If you all have any additional questions, come see me and I'll pass those along to Kenny, and look forward to seeing you all next week.
How old are your kids?
I have a 17-year-old and a 20-year-old.
Okay, 17 and 20.
So they're right in the heart of this.
As are you.
What do you do?
Yes, sir.
At the church, nationally, we've lost a couple of generations. We're dwindling. Yearly.
Right.
And I don't comprehend it, but I think a lot of it's got to do with this. We're not engaging our church, and this is why it's so important people like Kenny are there. I mean, frankly, I didn't know what he did. Now I've got a bit of an idea on it. But nationally, we're losing the battle.
It has to do with family strengths and disintegration of
Yes,
family
right,
values.
and the church itself. I'm talking about Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, everybody. A normal, what we call normal church, is dwindling.
Thank you.
I think the engagement is being lost
Engagement's
for a lot of reasons.
Well, and the other thing
Church
too,
competes with a lot.